Okay, good evening everyone and welcome to tonight's MLA Productivity and Profitability webinar. We are discussing the prime land benchmarks for the 2019-20 from the Aggregate Consulting benchmarking database. My name is Hilary. I work for Aggregate Consulting. I am your facilitator and presenter tonight, so I hope you enjoy the presentation. To get started, some housekeeping. You should see this control panel at the top right-hand corner of your screen. The red arrow button on the left collapses and reinstates the control panel. You should be able to hear us, but I cannot hear you, so please type your questions in the box provided. At the end of the webinar, I will address these questions, so please make them as succinct as possible, and I will answer them to the best of my ability. So just a little bit about Aggregate Consulting. And me, Hilary, is a consultant in Aggregate in Wagga Wagga. Aggregate manages a farm benchmarking database that records production and financial performance of over 200 businesses from across southern Eastern Australia. Aggregate provides a unique service that combines benchmarking data, farm economics and finance with the science or production systems to help clients improve their profitability and to grow their farm businesses. Yeah, so as I said, I will be presenting tonight's webinar. We're going to be looking at an encore of Sandy's beef webinar a fortnight ago, and we're going to be looking at the prime land benchmarks from the 2019-20 year, which will be the 2019 spring. Just a little bit about the data before I get started. So the aggregate prime land benchmarking data set will be the 2019-20 data set. So the participants within that benchmarking data set do benchmark a range of seasons, whether they benchmark calendar year, production year, which is April to March, or financial year, which is obviously July to June. They all share the same spring, which will be the 2019 spring. When we're looking at prime land data, obviously the primary focus is land production. If you draw a line from Brisbane down to Adelaide, we predominantly benchmark producers in the southeast corner of Australia. So New South Wales into Victoria, predominantly southeastern South Australia, down into Tasmania. The participants that we benchmark are not your average or not your ABARES sample, so it's not an average of the whole database, in that people choose to benchmark their business. So really it is a biased sample in that people benchmark their business in order to analyse and look at where they can improve their business, and therefore it is classified as a biased sample. So bear that in mind when you looking at the benchmarking data sets for tonight. The number of enterprises benchmarked for prime land in this year was 62, which in context of the industry is not a large number at all. So also bear that in mind when we get into the data. So obviously, 62 enterprises, a total DSE of 695,000 benchmarked, and 15,000 tonnes of lamb sold. The database, when you're looking at prime lamb, is breeding enterprises. Within that prime lamb database, there is a self-replacing portion, so those that retain new lambs and join them, and a terminal portion as well. It's about 50-50, terminal being that new replacements are purchased in every year. So it's a 50-50 mix in the data set. I'm recording. So when you're looking at the net profit per DSE from the 2019 data, it is obvious that profits are going to be skewed to the less drought affected areas. So the graph that you can see here, we have split out those in New South Wales. into Central West, South and East tablelands, which is your Monero region, and the Riverina Murray, which is that sort of encompasses Wagga and across the pastoral region. I then haven't split out South Australia and Tasmania and Vic because within those regions, the participants that benchmarked their prime land enterprises did not show significant signs of being affected by drought. When you look in New South Wales, there were regions in there that you can say were significantly affected by drought. However, they're a very small proportion, less than 20% of the data set was in that Central West and South and East tablelands. The Riverina Murray, you can say was definitely drought affected. However, they were able to, they were a bit luckier, I guess, than the Central West and South and East tablelands. Where, you know, their profits are really eaten up by supplementary feed, whereas in the Riverina Murray, spending the extra money on feed really helped maintain the profits, whereas Central West and South and East tablelands were really about more about survival. So that small portion of the data set that was really affected by drought and obviously had high costs associated with drought, such as supplementary feed, you're not seeing massive effects. They're not affecting the averages unduly across the average, and they're certainly not affecting the top 20% unduly either. So when you're looking at tonight's data set, just be reminded that there is a small portion that has come through as the effects of drought, but largely it was a really good season for the rest of the cohort. So cost of production for the 2019-20 year climbed again, but prices were really forgiving in that year. What I mean by cost of production is the total cost divided by the kilograms produced. So in the benchmarking, we calculate that by the total prime land expenses times by the percentage of lamb income divided by the kilograms of lamb dress weight produced. So on the graph in your screen now, we have the cost of production as from 1998 through to the 2019-20 year, which is represented by the 2020 year. The green line is your cost of production, so dollar per kilogram dress weight, and the blue line is price received, dollar per kilogram dressed weight. So the high cost of production was softened by historically high prices, which meant margins were still good, but they certainly weren't the best and certainly weren't where they should be in definitely in the 2021 year. The average of the database had a price received of $8.21 and a cost of production of $6.44. The top 20% had a really similar price received of $8.23, but a cost of production of $4.31. So they were able to retain $2.15 per kilo more than the average. So the high cost of production from that year and really from a lot of the years historically has hindered the ability to generate margins seen in other enterprises. Hopefully we will address that later in the presentation. So in terms of production, 2019-20 was the highest historical production per hectare, per 100 mils and per DSE. So what's on the screen in front of you now is the production of kilograms of lamb dressed weight per hectare. The average across the database was 137 kilos per hectare. Lamb production per hectare per 100 mils averaged at 22.8, and lamb production kilograms per DSE was 9.4. So you can see the graph in front of you over that 23-year period, production has increased quite significantly. In fact, about 60%. So prime lamb producers in the database are really good at generating extra production, but they're not so good yet at making more profits, in that the cost of production has really chased that profit up. And so we haven't seen margins improve as yet significantly. On to your production per DSC, was definitely back at historical highs. The top graph here is what you can see over a 23-year period of where the production kilograms of lamb per DSC is. As I said, the 2020 figure was 9.4 DSC, kilograms per DSC. So it's certainly at an all-time high. This is really driven, so production per DSC is driven by three things: lamb sale weight, growth rate to sale, and fertility. So you can see in this bottom right-hand graph here, hopefully, that production per head sold was at an all-time high. However, you can see on the left here that the lambs weaned per ewe join was actually down year on year and remains relatively flat historically anyway. So out of the three things, production per head sold and was up, lambs per weaned join was down, so we can assume that growth rate to sale was up fairly significantly in that year. We haven't yet benchmarked growth rate to sale, but that is something that we'll be bringing into the benchmarking in 2021, because it really is a significant factor into generating really good profits in your prime lamb business. So what does this all mean? So your 2021 target should really be able to blow the 2011 data out of the water. So what you can have in front of you now is your 1998 to 2020, so 23 years worth of net profits per DSC. The 2011 data is highlighted in that yellow bar graph there, where you can see profits were above that $25 per DSC. The price in 2011 was $6.40, which is really nowhere near current prices now. Production is 20% better than in 2011. This is also due to some change in methodology with the self-replacing flocks over the last 5-6 years or so. We've started selling ewe lambs out of the flock and then buying them back in as breeders. So we're capturing all that lamb production, which wasn't happening before. However, cost of production has also increased, and by a whopping 70%, and price has lifted by 28%. So hopefully if you can get your cost structure under control, you should really be hitting some super profits in that 2021 year. So what was special about 2011, apart from Julia? The price received was $6.41. Cost of production was down at $3.77. So the margin for that data set was $2.64, which generated that $25 profit per DSC. So at $8 a kilo, you need a cost of production of $5.40 to get to that $25 net profit per DSC. But in this year that we're going into, you should really be targeting super profits, because there's really no time like it. So a cost of production of $4.50, which is is what our top 20% database does, should be your target for this 2021 year. So that means that 10 kilos of lamb per DSC, the cost target should be less than $45 per DSC, or around $120 per ewe joint. So what you've got in front of you is we identified the difference between the top 20% and the average in terms of costs and where they're being derived within the prime lamb enterprise. On the left, you have the 2019 data, so the costs in that year. You have the left bar graph is the top 20%, and the right is the average, and the x-axis is the cost of production, or the left axis is the cost of production dollar per kilogram dressed weight. So you can see the top 20%, the light green is the supplementary feed, the dark green is the labour, and the orange is the sheep trading. So they're the three things that we have identified that seem to be the significant difference between the top 20% and the average in terms of what's been spent on the enterprise. Over on the right, you have a 5-year average, which tells the same story. The significant difference between the top 20% and the average in terms of supplementary feed, labour and sheep trading. So just for some reference, the top 20% cost of production on a 5-year average is $4, and the average cost of production on a 5-year average is $5.50. So there's a $1.50 difference in cost of production on average, which is, like I said, made up by primarily 3 things: your supplementary feed, labour and sheep trading. So supplementary feed is really a systems issue. So making sure that maximum growth rate to sale can be achieved during the period where feed is the cheapest, which is going to be your winter, spring. Anything that demands any summer or autumn fodder is going to increase that cost in that system. Sheep trading is a flock structure, is something to look at in your flock structure. So looking at how often you turn your ewes over, at what age, what are your culling practices. And then, as always, labour efficiency is a massive thing in all enterprises that we look at generally. So making sure you have a simple enterprise mix, simple production systems, maintaining plant and equipment in good working order, cost-effective investment into labour-saving technology, and planning husbandry procedures with labour efficiency in mind. So your production targets really haven't changed significantly then over the years. Sandy did a webinar on this about 3 years ago, and not much has really changed since then. So you want to target that 27 kilos of lamb per hectare per 100 mils, 10 kilos of lamb dress weight per DSE, 1 ewe joined per hectare per 100 mils, 130% lambs weaned per ewe joined, and that 21 kilos of dress weight per lamb sold. So growth rate to sale will be critical in achieving the production targets. So setting your prime lambing day is really about maximum growth rate to sale and your target market, not really matching feed demand and availability, but making sure that you're really targeting that maximum growth rate to sale in that period. So that's why we advocate for a winter lambing in a prime lamb enterprise, not spring, because spring is really the easiest time to achieve growth in offspring. So your lambing and turn-off time should really reflect this. Targeting a 300 gram per head per day from birth to sale as an average across all lambs sold is going to be a really good result for your business. So really anything that's out of season or dependent on summer and autumn fodder is really going to likely to be less cost effective, because it's just cheaper to get your key production targets over winter and spring fodder. The other thing that is going to be really important going into this next year is making sure your stocking rate is near long-term carrying capacity, because you're not going to hit a lot of those production targets without having your stocking rate where it should be. And for a lot of you, that might mean purchasing stock in now, or if you haven't already, you might be looking at doing that. I just wanted to show how that would look within a business depending on what you paid today. So this graph is essentially showing you how much you have to lose on a purchase you make today. So along the bottom axis is your price paid for you if you went out and bought her tomorrow. On the x-axis is the capital loss available, so how much you have to lose before you can achieve, or before your return on investment drops to 10%. I put in a gross margin assumption of $70 a DSE and a gross margin assumption of $45 a DSE. The reason why I've done that is because a gross margin of $70 per DSE is what our top 20% producers did in the 2019-20 year, and should be more than achievable for the average database in the 2021 year. The gross margin of $45 a DSE is what we saw in the 2011 year. So if something happens and the market does revert quite significantly and we're starting to generate less of a gross margin, then what would that look like? So looking at the light green line, at $400 price paid today, to get a 10% return on investment at a $70 DSE gross margin, the U needs to fall nearly 50% in value to $250 per head. So that's a significant drop before you get to that 10% return on investment. At $45 gross margin per DSE, you don't have as much room to move, but that's okay. You still got just under 30% to $341 per DSE. So in my opinion, that $400 U is, if that's all, you obviously, that doesn't mean go out and pay that. You still should be looking for bargains. But if that's what it is, then it's worth the risk. And price needs to drop over $2 to get back to the 2011 gross margins, which has actually only happened, or it has happened once in our benchmarking. And it only lasted one season, in that it was 1 year and then it was back up to the previous year's levels. So it's certainly, if you're understocked and prices seem a bit daunting, then it's certainly worth the risk in our opinion. If it comes out that you you're not that worse off, or you don't make any money, but at least you've got that asset there now. I will also mention that the cost is also replicated in breeding up, so don't be lulled into thinking that is the cheaper option. It almost never is. You're going to be losing foregone sales, and the opportunity cost is way too great, particularly in a season that we're about to go into, to be thinking that breeding up is going to be better than buying in, even at that $400 per head. So just to finish off, there's a real opportunity to make extraordinary profits if you can get your house in order this year. So making sure that you're fully stocked, or at least starting to get there. We need to be there before the production begins to capture everything that you can. Making sure your systems are in order by ensuring you've got the best lambing date possible. It'll be the winter for the majority, so you can really target that growth over the spring period and have the turn-off time prior to when any additional feed is required. And as we spoke about, really trying to keep those costs under control. So aiming for that $120 per you joined, which includes depreciation, owner labour, supplementary feed, and all other cash costs in there as well is going to be a big one for this 2021 season. All right, that's it from me. If you've got any questions, please type them in and send them through. I'll just have a little. If you do have to head off, you will be presented with a survey as you exit the webinar. Could you please take 2 to 3 minutes to fill out this survey? It provides feedback to MLA, the aggregate facilitators and the presenters like me this evening, to make sure that the topics are relevant, and if there's anything else you want us to look into or deliver on that you're interested in for production and profitability in your business. Okay, I'll just give you, if you want to send any questions through, please do. There's none that have come through as of yet. Give you a few if you've got a minute, but otherwise. Yes, those of you who are asking, the webinars are recorded and are available on the MLA website. This should be up by tomorrow or Friday. So if you are wanting to rewatch this webinar, that's where it will be. And all other webinars are as well. And okay, first question, can you run through the U purchase price slide again? Sure. Okay, so essentially what the graph is showing is how much, I'll just move this question here, right, is how much you have to lose on a purchase that you make today. So if you're paying, if you're going out and buying ewes at $400 per head, and your gross margin is at $70 per DC, the capital loss that you can have on that ewe before you move down to a 10% return on investment is nearly 50%. So the value of that ewe can drop back to $250 per head before you drop down to that 10% return on investment. So the point I'm saying is that the value of that ewe has to drop significantly before you even get to a 10% return on investment, which is where you're probably going to be breaking even after you take into account overhead and finance costs. So my point is that a $400 ewe, yes, may seem fairly significant, but if you're understocked and that's where you can find, if you can't find anything better, then it's better than not having it at all, because at least you've got, at least you're having a crack pretty much. I hope that clarifies that up a little bit. The next question, on the top 20%, there was no trading costs for 2020. Does this mean they were self-replaced? No, there were no trading costs for 2020 because there were two reasons for that. Generally, you'll find that in that year, there were people that either increased their inventory, or there were people that sold down inventory during the drought. So the top 20% in that year would have increased their number of stock on hand, hence that their trading value or their sheep trading value would have been positive on average. And the average, which were more had, I guess, more drought affected data sets in them, would have been those data sets that sold out of ewes and therefore decreased their inventory value of ewes, and therefore would have made trade losses on their sheep trading. I hope that answers that question. What type of pasture feed base do the top 20% predominantly use to achieve growth rates, etc.? So there is a mixture in the top 20%, predominantly pasture-based feed. There are a number that use grazing crops, but we don't see any significant advantage, particularly in the top 20% of those who use grazing crops to those who use just your general pasture base, with obviously significant inputs, or not significant, but adequate inputs of fert and nitrogen, that kind of stuff. But there's no significant benefit in the top 20% that we see in the prime lamb when using grazing crops. So what time period does that capital loss occur over? Are we talking the sale price you can achieve? You don't have to. Are we talking the sale? So that the capital loss over that period is generally a trade. So obviously once you get above a certain age group, there is depreciation involved in that, which is not included in that, what I'm talking about in that capital loss. So it is within that sort of first 3 to 4 years of the trade. But yeah, once you get, like, so you can't expect a $400 use to still be worth $360 when she's 7 years old. So it'll be over sort of that first 2 to 3 year period. Is there a difference in profitability between self-replacing and bought-in systems? There's not a huge difference between the two systems. We, in general, we find that the terminal systems do generate slightly higher profits, and that's just because your ewe lamb portion of your flock is going to be your most expensive portion. So if you have the ability to run a terminal system well, it's going to have a lower cost structure to it. But not to say that there are certainly top 20% producers that are self-replacing, but in general the terminal system is ever so slightly more efficient. Have you done any analysis on comparisons on self-replacing versus buying ewes? So under what assumptions? Yeah, so as I was saying, we pretty much just in the benchmarking looked at the self-replacing versus terminal systems. And as I said, both systems do come through in the top 20%. We find the terminal system is just a little bit easier in terms of that you don't have that ewe lamb portion, which are going to be the hardest part of your flock in terms of cost and production. So that terminal system does generally come out on top. But as I said, there is also really well run self-replacing systems there as well. So next question, what is the average turn-off weight of lambs in the top 20% of producers, and what's the average flock age between average producers and the top 20%? So in this, generally the top 20% generate a 21 kilo dress weight per head or above. That 19-20 year, we saw a lot around that 23 kilos of dress weight sold in that top 20%. In terms of flock age, the structure, the top 20%, I can't actually answer that, sorry. But if you would like to email me your question just regarding that flock age structure, I'd be happy to have a look at that and answer that for you. So what are the gross profit and net profit margins in the top 20%? So your top 20% is generating over that $25 per DSE net profit. In the prime lamb, they're generating $70 in the 19-20 year of gross margin. So that minus what was there? So you'd probably be looking at around $100 per DSE gross profit for your top 20%. Do you analyse crossbred to terminals versus dual purpose merinos to terminals? Yes, we do. So what we were just looking at this evening was typically your first cross, second cross and composite prime lamb enterprises. We then have a dual purpose enterprise separate, which is your merinos joined to a terminal sire. And then we have your wool businesses, which is your merinos to merinos. So if there aren't any more questions, I hope I read them out all right. That will be all for this evening. Thank you everyone for jumping on. Thank you all for the questions. We will be back in a fortnight's time with Livestock Logic going to talk about pink eye in weaner cattle. Thanks again and good evening.